Hi, this is a recording of a talk I did several years ago for USF Osher Learning Institute for Senior Citizens. This was on sleep, history, and science. Okay, and I thought that would be of interest to more than the people who attended in person. So we'll get started. And now the simplest definition of sleep that one can give is sleep is of the brain, by the brain, and for the brain, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln's things about democracy. And sleep is to take repose by the natural suspension of consciousness. That's the Oxford English Dictionary definition, by the way. And the more scientific definition is rather long and a mouthful, but I'll say it anyway. Sleep is a restorative process that is brain regulated and reversible because you wake up. Homeostasis, a big concept in physiology where the balance is restored, embedded in circadian and social physiological organization, and it involves a species specific, because bird sleeps differently than you and I do, quiescent posture, and some amount of perceptual disengagement and elevated arousal thresholds. So this is quite a mouthful, but it really describes the entire physiological complex procedures that are underlying mechanisms of sleep. Okay, moving on to like all roads lead to Rome. That way, in natural sciences, because there was no real science, but natural philosophy that goes back to Aristotle in the Western culture. And these are the three big statements that he's credited with. It can be roughly translated as on sleep and awakening, on dreams, on divination through sleep. And this goes back to almost 300 to 400 years before Christ, before current era. And obviously, in those days, there were many gods, and dreams were kind of messages from the gods and predicting about the future, and had a sort of a healing power, okay, a natural state that required both body and soul, okay. And obviously, the soul was the center of, the heart was the center of soul and sense of perception. Okay, so this was a complex interplay between brain, stomach, and heart. Okay, that he hypothesized. Okay, other philosophers, you know, the philosopher named Alcmaeon, who was even before Aristotle, it seems, from the time that is was able to find blood drains from the surface of the blood vessel, causing loss of consciousness. Okay, which is a good guess, but okay. And then again, getting back to Aristotle, he said the sleep is a seizure of a primary sense organ, and you're unable to use its power. Okay, and so this was, a variety of thoughts were proposed by various intellectuals of that era. Okay, and consciousness resided in sleep, as we mentioned earlier. I mean, in heart rather. Okay, and the god of medicine, Asclepius, who is associated with the snakes, and this is called the cult of Orpheus, is one of incubation. On the right, we see a patient sleeping on the couch, and on the foreground there is Eros, who's like a human doctor who's treating his right shoulder. Okay, and this is the content of the dream. At the same time, there is a sacred snake that is either biting or healing animal, okay, of the sleeping patient. So, and this was, and the other on the other side, on the pillar, votive steel commemorates the god's act of healing. So that was a very dramatic incorporation of religion, health, medicine, and humans. And even further back, going further back to several thousand years before Aristotle, okay, Egyptian Book of Dreams, had tried to systematically interpret varieties of dreams, as many as 108, okay, and with various activities and emotions, and these are make a good reading, okay. A deep well meant a prison, which is not too far off. A mirror indicates a second wife. Now that is a little different to stretch. A shining moon was associated with forgiveness. They were into cats, and a large cat symbolized a bumper crop, and so on and so forth. And if a man sees himself in a dream, that's a bad sign. And if a man sees himself drinking warm beer, that means he's suffering. And then if he's looking out of a window, that means it's a good sign. Okay, and so there are many interesting parts that were uh, proposed at that time. So, okay, again, not really very true scientific, but makes a good copy. Getting back to the classics, okay, in the classic epic, the Odyssey is, almost oozing with sleep, about when he's trying to return from his voyages. He's going home to his bed, and his ever-suffering wife Penelope, she uses insomnia to keep all those Lotharios or suitors, as they used to call them, away. And then again, she was a smart lady, and she's unable to recognize this man after so many years. And so she asked him to verify the location of the bed, by moving it to a different location. Okay. And then again, they are guided by the goddess Athena. Okay. And then even when people, another character named Eumaeus, okay, offers him his bed. Okay. And the same way, the importance of sleep is, very current. I did this talk during the Obama era, and obviously, with the hectic schedule that the presidents have to maintain, he was looking forward to getting a well-deserved rest for several months, not just several days. Okay, and moving back to the Renaissance, Leonardo, he caught cat naps, sleeping for a little time, which we can say that so-called micro sleep, so polyphasic sleep. Okay, and again, I'll have varieties of quote from the literature, so I'm not going to go into it at this time. Okay, and so this is again, this was, and later on, even before Shakespeare. Okay, there were others, physicians, scientists, philosophers, or gentlemen. He rehashed many of the Aristotelian influence lasted for several hundred years, if not thousands. Okay, and so this was, the classic thinking had a long reach. Okay, and then we'll talk about the Shakespearean era and the literature codes later on. Moving on to the early days of Enlightenment, the great French scientist, philosopher, okay, René Descartes, who is credited with the mind-body dualism, okay, and he obviously the concept of soul was very much in vogue even at that time, and dissection was becoming very easily practiced and permitted by the church. So the only single or unpaired organ that was found was a tiny area in the brain called pineal gland. And so he surmised, probably not too far off, that it's the seat of the soul. Okay, obviously where the soul resided was a matter of conjecture and guesswork, but it made a good story. And then again, obviously with the class distinction, the king of the great kingdom of France, King Louis XIV, he owned as many as 400 beds. How and when, why, that is, your guess is as good as mine. And obviously, in the more scientific early birth of neurology, the credit goes to Christopher Wren in contemporary Dr. Willis, who did the anatomical dissection, and the medical students still give him credit for the circle of Willis, which is the circle of blood vessels that are on the undersurface of the brain, and supplies the vital parts of the brain. And if there is obstruction, then it can cause a massive stroke, and so on and so forth. And if that is traumatized, it can get brain hemorrhage and can cause some serious consequences. But I don't digress too far. Okay, continuing with our trip down the line. Okay, that obviously, and this was the early days of electricity. People from the Roman and Greek era were aware of the electricity in electric fish, or what the Europeans called it torpedo fish, and the sailors had described it. And the early experiments were done with the rise of voltaic battery in recording the electrical potentials in muscles. And the Italians were on the forefront, starting with the Luigi Galvani, and that's why it's still called galvanic current. And the same ideas were extended to other organs of the body, and brain activity in sleep was, attempts were made, but a brain is protected by the thick skull, so it was hard going. Okay, but the idea was being promoted. And on the other side, in Northern Europe, the great Swiss anatomist botanist Carl Linnaeus, who devised the classification in species of all animal and botanical world, he proposed that flowers had a type of clock which responded to the sunlight and had a natural rhythm. And he went on to long extent. And at the same time, during the Napoleonic era, that he slept a relatively short time. And in the medical establishment, there is always a good guessing game of trying to see what the people who died several hundred years before us, to what kind of illness they had. Abe Lincoln is thought to have something called Marfan syndrome, and so on and so forth. But Napoleon could have very well had Pickwickian syndrome. He was short and chubby, and slept very poorly. Okay, he got up at 3 o'clock, and so it is a good guess, but there's no way to prove or disprove that. Okay, so the muscle activities were recorded, and just to digress one way, because of the concept that Descartes proposed that animals don't have soul, vivisection and dissection, because animals were considered without any feelings. So all sorts of horrible experiments, which would make us cringe, were done in the early days of electricity research, including shocking an elephant, and obviously, in the struggle that went on between AC and DC current. Moving on to more modern era, the first scientific work was done by a gentleman named Robert McNeish, who wrote the Philosophy of Sleep. Okay, and then obviously there is a Mimosa pudica flower and plant, which is very sensitive to touch and sensitive to light as well. So that was proposed, and then again, more physiological recordings of the body temperatures were made, and so associating with the changes that took place in physiology. Okay, and so people had proposed, as to varieties of mechanisms as to how it's kind of a philosophical or metaphysical death, which is temporarily, obviously, and similar process came on into being with the induction of anesthesia. Okay, and in the early days of nitrous experiments followed shortly on their tail by chloroform and anesthesia. So that was another way of inducing a reversible sleep, or almost simulating a death. And obviously, the sleep habits of the early humans were quite different, and that led to the rush of light in terms of the whaling adventure that took place, because the whale oil was good for candle lamps. And that again changed with the discovery of gaslighting. And now, then, even before the current era of EEG, electroencephalogram discovery, several physicians had made attempts to record brain waves, dating back to a doctor named Richard Canton. And then just based on clinical observation, various illnesses were diagnosed. So the first prima facie one being narcolepsy, where without any warning, the brain literally shuts down and you fall asleep and you can hurt yourself. Okay, so these were varieties of discoveries that were done. Okay, and then there were other Greek and Italian scientists who studied dogs and recorded what we now know as rapid eye movement, as to how the eyeballs are moving without any intentional purpose, and that is preserved in all animals, including mammals, and that is us. Okay, and then obviously the literature people had their say with Rip Van Winkle, who slept, and was the classical tale by Washington Irving. Okay, and some other discoveries that I just thought they were interesting as to how the bed and coil springs were marketed for comfort. And the sleep in culture, that was the classical Charles Dickens novel, The Pickwick Papers, and was published. And the character is a classic depiction of what we can very reasonably surmise as sleep apnea syndrome, snoring, sleepy, and being overweight. Okay, and then lots of other people had sleep disorders, and they're well known in literature and described. Okay, starting from Winston Churchill to Van Gogh to Marilyn Monroe and Thomas Alva Edison. So, and the famous discoverer of the light bulb. And obviously, working for them was not easy because of their habits of working through the night. Okay, and then later on, with the more advance of chemistry, primarily in Germany and later in Britain and United States, varieties of drugs were available to treat the potentially serious condition of narcolepsy, and ephedrine, which was stimulants, and then subsequently amphetamines, which was a larger group, a similar chemical, were marketed. And but obviously, then people quickly realized the habit-forming potential of those drugs, and now more acceptable with relatively less, but nonetheless side effects are being marketed. One called Ritalin, which many of you may have heard about, and another one was called Provigil, that the military had huge interest in it for soldiers. So, okay, and then later on, that with the improvement in electricity and recording equipment, that led to the discovery of brain waves and electroencephalogram, and the varieties of waves that were labeled with Greek letters called alpha and delta waves, and the sleep spindle. So I'll have a slide for that later on as we move along. Okay, and as some of you know very well, that in 1953 was the rise of changing from classification biology and working on experimental animals in the early days of genetics in the early 20th century. A rise of molecular medicine era was entered in early on with the discovery of DNA, and later on with the DNA structure. So at that time, inspired by the work of Erwin Schrödinger, yes, the famous Erwin Schrödinger, who wrote the Schrödinger's cat, phenomenon, and which has become a common knowledge and commonly used expression. Okay, is it alive or dead? And he, when he was in exile in Ireland from the Nazi Germany, wrote a book called What is Life? Okay, and that inspired a lot of physicists to extend the idea that biology and life can be explained with physics and chemistry, and they switched careers, including Watson and another South African physicist who switched to molecular biology. And initially, they worked with the smallest organisms, something called phage, which are actually another word for viruses. that do not attack humans, but actually attack bacteria. So they worked on phage therapy, and the prototype research source or animal, a fruit fly. And based on a very methodical mapping of genes, they isolated several genes, which even it may surprise you that yes, even lowly fruit fly sleeps and has genes that control the fruit fly behavior. So this was coming into foray, and then obviously with the more anatomical dissection, the brain areas which were responsible for a light and dark cycle perception were localized. And so sleep science is relatively new in the late 20th, the second half of 20th century. The first textbook of sleep medicine only appeared as late as 1989, and the sleep centers were established in the 1970s, and now they have exploded and has been associated with various heart disease, personality disorder, depression, etc. So sleep is coming into limelight, evidenced by the amount of research and clinicians who are specializing, usually from pulmonary branch, and some neurologists, primarily the lung specialist. Okay, now we do not want to just strictly stick with science, but I ventured outside my comfort zone and looked at some of the artwork that depicted sleep. So here are some of the examples that will go across. You know, the famous Botticelli describes Mars and Venus. As you can see, Mars is incapacitated. The god of war is helpless and dead to the world, literally, and being gazed upon by the beautiful Venus. Okay, and even at that time, even though as powerful as he was thought to be, he's becomes a plaything for babysitters. Okay, so during sleep, even the gods are helpful. So that is the what he wants to convey, one can say. Okay, moving on to sleeping Venus. So she's alone, and the curves of the body mimic the landscape of the exposed armpit shows, the come hither or seduction of mode. And, so you can just say it depicts the sleeping beauty, okay, and in natural surroundings. That is by an Italian artist named Giorgione, okay. And the famous Caravaggio, okay, he describes Mary and baby Jesus sleeping, okay, and on the side here, and I don't know, so flight into Egypt, as you can see that the scholars are around him. So that was obviously a very religious, theme that is depicted. Okay, that even the quote unquote the Son of God is not above, that requires sleep, for restoration. Okay, and then the classic tale in the work Aeneid, okay, Dido, who was jealous of her lover who was leaving her, and it sets fire to the bed and dies. So, and it's about so the whole story revolves around getting out of bed, and he uses bed to tell the story. After he leaves, she throws fire on the bed and kills herself, and literally deathbed as the pulpit. Okay, and obviously, most of us, unless we are warriors, die in bed. So, and obviously, some of the famous last words have been recorded as to by Winston Churchill. I mean, obviously, a very cynical way of looking at it. I'm bored with it all. On the FDR, who is suffering from severe hypertension and recurrent strokes, I have a terrific headache. Okay, so this is, the famous last word type of thing. And I recall, that one of my associates, literally heard the last heartbeat of a patient who died while he was examining him. So there is no time to tell, and obviously we're science is still trying to figure out what is the ultimate thing. So, and I did another class on history of senses, and we talks about, the breath comes in pairs, usually inspiration and expiration. The only two times the breath comes in single, which I thought was very clever, that when you're born, you take your first breath, and when you die, you take your last breath. So the only time it comes in a single digit is the first and the last breath. Okay, so I thought that was a very clear-cut observation from a very well-known author on history of senses. Okay, and again, then the sleep, again, this was a depiction or a whimsical one of a dysfunctional family. The wife is sleeping, gambling leads to gluttony, and obviously, there is a hint of prostitution. Okay, and it's like she's being entertained, and then a monkey who stops time. So it's like, and you can just see how the dog is stealing the food. It's the whole household is in literally disarray. Okay, so it shows how sleep you lose control over any situations. And again, similarly depicted, how this poor young girl is being teased by tickling her. And so one can say it's a state of innocence. And you see pictures on YouTube videos of how babies can fall asleep just about anywhere, even when being transported on the on a wheeled suitcase. There was a very cute picture which I had some slides somewhere, but I did not upload it. As to how this little girl was sleeping on the suitcase that being dragged to the airport by her parents. Okay, and then the Francisco Goya, that is, talks about the disturbing, rather scary dreams, which affect people, and sleep of reason. So because obviously it's nightmares and monsters, so it's a depiction about the not all sleeping experiences, because the brain literally rehashes the good and the bad side of our experiences, at a different level. Okay. And then again, another painter named Henry Fuseli, so sleep is marked by various hallucinations and three. Okay, and that is the concept of the demon. Okay, and there's a concept of something called incubus in Latin, man lying upon. This is the kind of a scary creature that's lying upon this poor woman. Okay, and it's trying to who is trying to seduce whom? That is, was the your guess is and mine. Okay, and so there are varieties of nightmaric situation have been depicted in clinical situation as well as in art. Okay, and then again, sleep and death analogy is well depicted by in this particular painting by John Waterhouse. Okay, sleep and half brother death. Okay, so that's like one is alive and one is dead, and it's hard to tell who's alive, who's dead, unless you really go and do a clinical examination. Okay, and many times it's really hard to determine, whether actually, sometimes, at least the early physicians in training can sometimes, be petrified as trying to certify death. Okay. And going back to the Eastern culture in the Indian classic, which is Mahabharata, where two the good and evil sides of two princely kingdoms are fighting. Lord Krishna was depicted with the halo around him, and the famous warrior on one side is dying and he wants to rest. So the two sides come together and create a bed on the war zone by shooting arrows in the ground and creating a very hastily made bed so that the great warrior can breathe his last breath. So this was depicted, the death of Bhishma. This is an 18th century depiction. Okay, and getting back to the more times that we recognize the famous Vincent van Gogh, he describes two laborers resting at noon on a bale of hay. Okay, so it's again the poor and rich difference is brushed off and is depicted by the famous American artist John Singer Sargent, okay, who describes this obviously a rich lady was a luxury of sleep, okay, and you can just see that. So no man is exempt, okay. And then again, similarly, biblical themes of Adam and Eve, okay, after their so-called sin, are resting in the earthly paradise. Okay, so they have been kicked out for, okay. And then again, this whimsical appearance of dream, okay, the nude lying on a couch, okay, how that got in the middle of the jungle, that's anybody's guess. And there is a creature playing instrument somewhere in this painting, okay. I'm trying to look, yeah, somewhere up here in this area, okay. And blue sky with moon shows, that. And dream is kind of a journey from away from reality. Just about anything can and does happen, usually. And some of the dreams are very reproducible, and we'll talk more about it, and later on. And again, that the sculptures, this is goes back to the early culture, Etruscans, nobody's quite sure who actually they were, but this is their funerary urn, it shows the death of a child that is sleeping peacefully. And this artwork, is in the famous Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. Okay. And then a lot of the things change with the discovery of electricity and lighting up of first Lower Manhattan and the Wall Street area by Edison, and that led to the current war between AC and DC, as I mentioned a little while ago. And he himself was a huge insomniac, and along with the difficulty in hearing, and he managed to take cat naps, and so and obviously, and there were other people who were his contemporaries, Charles Lindbergh and Joseph Stalin, were also poor sleepers. And Stalin is rumored to have stayed in bed till 4 o'clock and then start his day and calling his other comrades for a meeting in the middle of the night. Okay, and so this is, even scientists had their, oddities. So sleep in literature. Okay, and then the two people who are contemporaries were Robinson Crusoe and Jonathan Swift. Okay, and Jonathan Swift, before he became famous with Gulliver's Travels, he had written some essays on sleeping in church. Okay, may God escape from single, and then the famous poet, literary giant, and artist William Blake, may God escape from single vision and Newton's sleep. Okay, so who is, and he had various sculptures that are in the front of the British Museum. Okay, and what Gulliver's statement was that of all the misbehavior, none is comparable to those who come here to sleep. And the words of a preacher are effectual to lull you to sleep. Okay, and then obviously, and the classic statements from none other than Shakespeare is, obviously this is overly quoted, well-known statement from Shakespeare. Okay. And this is, obviously, as you may recall, it's from Hamlet, Act 3. And then there are other ones from Macbeth, sleep that needs I know, so you can just read it for yourself. I think I'm not going to read the slides, which is a big no. Okay, and so this is, so sleep has been brushed in part, and there's the famous poets where Robert Frost wrote the inmates of my cottage all at rest, solitude, and then he talked cradle infant sleeps at the side. So very poetic depiction of all the going ons and about of sleep, well stated by the great Robert Frost. Samuel Coleridge, on the other side of the Atlantic, was an insomniac, and and wrote various, lyrically about sleep. And going back to the Middle East, okay, the tales of Arabian Nights are incorporated with insomnia, and the poor young woman Shahrazada manages to survive by telling the cruel sultan various tales, and because he was anxious to see what happened, so he lets her live instead of killing her next morning. Okay, and so that's the the setting is gruesome, but the stories are escape into dreamland and full of imagination. Okay, and then again, the other plays of Shakespeare, they all have reference to sleep, credited to the great Falstaff in Henry IV. Okay, and then Prospero in The Tempest and Macbeth. So his writings are full of references to and about sleep. So it was a, and getting back to the poor scientist, the man who proposed the mind-body separation, the great René Descartes. He was uh, in the patronage of Queen Christina. Okay, I think of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or Russia. I'm not sure quite. I think it was Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he was not an early riser, but the Queen was, and she invited him in the early morning to discuss philosophy. And obviously, so instead of, and so he really did not handle it very well and died prematurely. Okay, and so this is the famous painting by him, by a gentleman named Niels Forsberg. This is available via Wikipedia, Descartes. And okay, and getting back to the more medical discoveries, an Australian physician who had some engineering background and had family members who were engineers. So, and he was worried about the sudden death from death of the SID syndrome, and from that he was devising some measure technology. So he reversed engineer vacuum cleaner and then tried to help babies who had sudden death syndrome due to respiratory difficulties, and then obviously he ventured further into adults into sleep apnea syndrome, and the rest is history. He discovered the cure with the so-called continued positive airway pressure, because the premature babies have low respiratory pressure, the lungs fill up with water, and that's why the positive pressure helps them survive. Okay, and still the science of sudden infant death is complicated and requires close monitoring by the frightened parents and intensive care units. Okay, so he extended his invention into sleep apnea, which is basically the same thing happens. And obviously, there are a lot more obese patients than premature babies. So that was history and the start of treatment for sleep medicine. And he was an entrepreneur par excellence, and went on to start a company called ResMed, which has a huge market share on CPAP machines out of Australia. And then there are various people who had emotional disorder who were thought to have spent a lot of time in bed, including the famous nurse Florence Nightingale, the poets W.P. Yeats, Charles Darwin, who had varieties of psychosomatic or real illnesses. Okay, Cardinal Richelieu, a critic Chesterton, and the musician Brian Wilson. Okay, so that's all sorts of people have had trouble with sleep. So and this to me was interesting. The two famous writers of the 17th century, Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver. Okay, and while Robinson Crusoe was a lot more work ethic and biblical references, and so it describes his character as a rest and wakes up refreshed on the solitary island where he was marooned, and even there he has a good work ethic and keeps Sabbath. On the other hand, Gulliver, he just crashes, when he's tired and sleeps, and he's tied down by the little inhabitants of the island, Lilliput. And when he wakes up in the morning, he pays to put out the fire. So this is, the two contrasting the two classic works was well listed. Okay, venturing into the veterinary field, there are other animals have a different habit of sleeping. Dolphins are mammals, so they can't sleep completely, because if they do, they would drown. And so they have evolved to dramatic extents of turning off half of the brain and keeping one eye, awake. So that's just a way of survival. So that's a dramatic. And then again, when mother dolphins have had babies, calf dolphins, they don't sleep for several months because otherwise they are worried about predators, who would attack the newborn. Okay, so this is one way. And similarly, giraffes, they're tall and big, but at the same time they can be easy prey to cats. Okay, I mean lions and cheetahs. Okay, so they sleep with one eye open and with ears that are moving. Okay, and similarly, brown bats can sleep up to 18 hours, but because they're nocturnal primarily. I'll have a nice video of horses sleeping, okay, and how they manage to get by with a relatively small sleep. So evolution has had evolved sleep depending upon the animal's survival. So the ultimate principle still boils back to the great Darwin about the survival of the fittest, okay, not the strongest necessarily, survival for that particular situation. So various evolutionary tricks nature has. Okay, and this cartoon depicts nicely that when ducks are in a group, okay, the one on the outside keeps the one eye open and on both ends, so that way they can be alert for predators. So this is depiction, in a cage, and similarly the cartoon depicts here, okay, very nicely the same phenomenon. Okay, so how the group intelligence takes hold. Okay, and hopefully I'll be able to play this video.
Sleeping while flying overseas in an airplane isn't exactly an amazing physical feat, but sleeping while physically flying over an ocean, frigate birds do it because brains. Hey frequent flyers, Trace here with you on DNews Today. Frigate birds have an impressive 6-foot wingspan, but their feathers aren't waterproof, so they can't rest on water, and yet they spend most of their lives at sea. The exception is when they breed. They do that on land. So if they can't land on water and only come to land to breed, how does this non-waterproof bird stay aloft over the ocean for weeks at a time? It all comes down to their brains. Most of us probably think of birds as flying around during the day and resting at night like we do, but frigate birds? Earlier this year, a team from the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology in Germany tracked the birds' brain activity by fitting them with small devices able to measure electroencephalographic changes, or EEGs, brainwaves, including slow-wave sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. Data was gathered over 10 days while the birds flew more than 3,000 kilometers, and it revealed amazing behavior. During the day, birds stayed awake, looking for fish or other birds to harass and steal food from. They're kind of jerks. But when you can't land on water, that's kind of how you gotta live. Then, at night, their brains did something super neat. Frigate birds, like humans, have one brain divided into 2 hemispheres, but it turns out frigates can shut down and rest only one hemisphere at a time, engaging it in short-term stages of slow-wave sleep. In other words, they sleep with one eye open while flying. The birds typically circle upward on air currents in the direction of their open eye, which is the one connected to the awake hemisphere. The researchers think they do this to watch where they're going and so they don't run into other birds. Incredible as this is, frigates are not the only animal that sleeps with half its brain awake at a time. It's an unusual sleep pattern called unihemispheric slow-wave sleep. Behaviorally, sleep is a period of rest in a species-specific posture. Physiologically, it's a state characterized by specific eye movements, muscle tonation, and cortical rhythms. In unihemispheric slow-wave sleep, only half of the cerebral cortex, the gray matter that covers both hemispheres of the brain, displays the characteristic patterns of sleep, while the other half shows neural activity of a waking state. During this time, the brain can't get into full REM sleep. It can only fall into shallower, slow-wave oscillation sleep. Unihemispheric slow-wave sleep is how dolphins can rest without drowning or being killed. A dolphin will shut down one hemisphere of its brain, leaving the other half of the brain to monitor breathing function and keeping that eye open to monitor its environment. The left eye will be closed when the right half of the brain sleeps and vice versa. It's also something a lot of birds do, like mallard ducks keeping one eye open to watch for predators while they rest. So this method of getting some shut-eye isn't exactly unheard of. But in the study of frigate birds, the researchers found something even more amazing. Apparently, frigate birds also occasionally shut down both hemispheres of their brain at once and somehow do not drop out of the sky like a hot rock. They don't do this for long, only a few seconds at a time, and all told, between the half-brain sleep and occasional full-brain sleep, they only get about 42 minutes of shut-eye a day when they're at sea. Humans prefer to rest the whole brain at once, but amazingly in certain situations, we can also do it a hemisphere at a time too. In humans, unihemispheric slow-wave sleep is associated with something called the first night effect, also known as your inability to get a good night's sleep in a new location. It's not a full separation between brain hemispheres, rather it's described as an asymmetry. One hemisphere is more active and vigilant, monitoring the environment for unfamiliar sounds in the new surroundings. So next time you have a bad night in a new environment like a hotel or new apartment, think of how cool it is that your brain is tapping into the same evolutionary advantage that birds and dolphins use, even though you'll probably be too tired to be amazed. And speaking of weird ways of sleeping in the air, what about insects? Do they sleep? Julian has the answer in this video right here. Have you guys experienced sleeping while...
Okay, so, and this is the same thing, which we talked about for dolphins. And you can see clearly, it's well documented, the brain waves are different from both sides. So it's not just an observation and without any clear-cut clinical evidence. And as I said earlier, this makes a in music business. Okay, that perhaps worked out very well for the Mongol army because they didn't have to wake up their horse. They just had to ride on it, kick, and off they go. Was as far as to start as a Tesla, perhaps. And this was just for humorous. I don't know the language, probably Chinese.
在电视上面的好东西很容易在瞬间就不见了呢。
And this reminds me of the rather corny joke from Monty Python that what do you think about sex on TV? He said, I just kept falling off. So that was in the early days that the zany guys of Monty Python had a somewhere. Now, getting more serious, the sleep and the body clocks, initially it was just relatively classified as the two processes, based on your circadian or body clocks. We are day creatures, so the circadian body clocks, most of us are awake during daytime and sleep. So that is called process S, and there's a distance that takes place. So it's basically like an hourglass type of pattern. And the process S, as this sleep pressure builds up on us, no matter how tough you are, it catches up with you. And so this is, so this is like a more physiological term, which can be stated as homeostatic sleep drive. So you're trying to restore the balance of your body, of all organs, starting from not just your brain, but your other organs, your stress, effects. And the longer you're awake, the more the pressure builds up. And that can be relieved only by deep non-REM rapid eye movement sleep. So even your new Apple Watch or Google Watch or a Fitbit watch can detect what type of sleep patterns we would have and will assign a score. How do they do it? It's beyond my pay scale. Okay, so I'm not going to get into it, but it really tells you that even though you may be in bed for 8 hours, you did not get enough sleep, so your sleep score is relatively low or fair. And now this is rather a busy slide, but I think I will try to explain. This is done by a talk from long-standing researcher in Dr. Russell Foster from University of Bristol, I think, and he gave a talk on body clock, and Britain has lots of tabloid, and obviously, the tabloid, the reporter extended the professor's logic and assigned various activities which were a particular time. Okay, I doubt very much that the professor said that you have sex at 6 a.m. and for making babies at 6 p.m. Okay, 6:30 p.m. So this is okay, and so I'm sure I'm sure that probably the last time he agreed to that interview. Okay, so but that was a tongue-in-cheek interpretation or reading more into it than he was actually stated. So there are particular times, and that again is much more used for sports and running and training. So, and again, we'll talk about we are not all exactly carbon copies of each other. The early night owls and early risers. So natural rhythms rule our body and dictate an ideal time. And it has a vast implication for your traveling across time zones. So they rule our best time for varieties of activity. Okay, so this is okay, and then again, this was a question, and he did some of the genetic basis of melatonin receptors and genes and connection with your organ anatomy with the something called suprachiasmatic nucleus. I'll talk at more length about it, and this was important that the eyes, even if you're blind, it may have a huge implication. So when you sense light, obviously varieties of chemical changes in a protein called rhodopsin takes place. The earlier molecule that was the preceded rhodopsin or light sensitive organs in the smallest cells was based on melatonin. So the structures were, so nature builds upon the original from what she already has. So, and they were now with the rise of genetic medicine, people were able to breed mice without rods and cones, and they still maintained this the body clock, so they were sensitive to light. And so Professor Russell was able to isolate a protein called melanopsin, which is based on the gene. Okay, so that was a secret. So there is underlying evolutionary basis that goes back to millions of years. Okay, and so this is the more detailed slide. So 10 a.m. to have bikini wax. Okay, because the pain is usually the lowest. Okay, so this was and so this was the co-author. So it's not entirely clear, but the pain receptors are not as alert. So that's okay. And at the same time, getting to more serious, how much sleep one needs. Obviously, all of you who are parents or have been babies, you remember the babies sleep almost all day. And then as you get older, and for the teenagers, it's obviously, they're ready to party at 11 o'clock. And that's creates a havoc when they have early high school, as it is in most of the Western world. Okay, and no wonder their grades suffer. So, and active sleep is very important for brain development. So we may be creating real havoc of poor grades, maybe have a lot to do with, sleep deprivation in high schoolers, because obviously 7 a.m. is not exactly ideal time to do advanced calculus for lots of teenagers. Okay, and in the same way, in the second, the later half of this thing, your body clocks get messed up, and obviously lots of people, spend a lot of time counting sheep or reaching for a drink, or going to your doctor asking for sleeping pills, and so that is again, we'll talk more about it as we go along in the second half of the talk. Okay, and then in lots of the Western countries, which are spread north to south, there is a system called daylight saving times, where fall backwards and spring forward. So they advance the clock artificially 1 hour, primarily to make it easy for school-going children who they do not want him to walk during dark, and so that's, but at the same time, the rest of the population pays a huge price. That when especially in fall, and the clocks are moved back, there's a higher incidence of strokes and heart attacks, more accidents, take place. Okay, and just historical note, that politicians, can mess up with the rules of society quite a bit, because Generalissimo Franco, who changed the clocks in Spain to mimic that of Germany, which was almost 2 time zones away, and instead of matching it the Greenwich Mean Time, to which they were much closer, geographically speaking. Okay, and there are varieties of chemicals that are involved in cells. This is one called synapsin. It's a chemicals which is inside vesicles that contains varieties of neurotransmitters, primarily such as acetylcholine, which is like the workhorse of signal transmission, this will, create the weight for the signal, and it rushes and releases the chemical in the cleft between 2 synapses and passes on the message. Okay, so proteins are the workhorse of all sorts of signal transmission, and neurologists had a lot of controversy in the early days as to, so the 2 schools of thought were between soups and cables. So they were arguing vehemently in scientific literature, but turns out both are equally valid. That the faster impulse, which is transmitted through myelin sheath of a nerve, has a lot to do with releasing chemicals in the cleft between 2 neurons. Okay, so that again, that gets down to more into neurology that we perhaps was not the intent of this class. Now, just to summarize, what are the functions of sleep? This is an important slide because it just increases the body and brain repair. Okay, so that way you can survive the stress of life and day-to-day activity, and repairs the body. So again, restores what we described as homeostasis. Okay, so it helps you, it improves your mood, it improves your memory and learning, and improves your survival skill. And it also, now it has been discovered, it also has a role in your immunity. And this was tested not just in high school or adults, but even in infants who could remember simple tasks that they were shown, after a nap. Okay, so the forming long-term memory and consolidation is very important. So the old axiom, to sleep on it, okay, and come up with the idea that has some physiological or scientific basis, okay, and similarly, if without sleeping, if you go around and play the tables in a gambling casino, your judgment is going to be impaired, and you'll make some foolish bets and end up losing your shirt. Okay. And then again, obviously, the nighttime snacking is well known, and a lot of us have been guilty that when you sleep less, there are varieties of lesser known hormones which came to be isolated only in the 1990s, called ghrelin, which is called time to eat, and leptin, which is the satiety hormone. They're messed up, and with less sleep, you can easily gain weight. So during exam time, a lot of dorm students will end up gaining weight because they'll be snacking at 2 o'clock in the morning and with mostly unhealthy food. And again, it's like a brain's flushing system. Your beta amyloid, which is the toxic protein, it goes down. So And now there are new lymphatic sort of drainage system from the glial cells have a huge role in it. Okay, so this was discovered only recently. And so this is, again, even the tiniest organism, such as a jellyfish, they're active during the night time. At night, they drop into to the bottom and seafloor and rest. And their rate goes down, and they relax their tentacles. So this has been well documented, and as evolutionary has been preserved for millions of years through the or tracing of evolution. So so it's called, basically it adopts the inactivity type of thing. So okay, so the sleep is really the fundamental restorative capacity, and a memory can be improved type of thing, and even just one can give like a silent messages to improve memory. So people were given a particular sound. Now this is an interesting study that sound was associated with random objects, and even sound during sleep, people had better recall. Okay, so that was an interesting scientific study. Obviously it's not valid for day-to-day use yet, but but at least it shows as to how sleep and memory are intricately related. Similarly, this is a more complicated slide, but let's see if we can make sense out of it, type of thing. So learning while sleeping. So this is again, the same thing that I talked about earlier. As you can see, a symphony in 2 movements at key phases. The slow wave show early part of the heart, and slow waves memories are reactivated. Okay, and the rapid eye movement is much later, and that doesn't have a whole lot relationship with memory. Okay, and these are the varieties of spindles that forms, and these are the more scientific recording of as to how and the pattern of the sleep and memory formation are intricately related. Okay, and that's perhaps so this is kind of and this was depicted in literature by Aldous Huxley, who wrote in A Brave New World, his classic about futuristic sci-fi about programming students. Okay, and the way the memory is transmitted, we'll talk to that in a few more slides. Okay, now this is and now the sleep has a lot to do with our stress. When you're under stress, the stress stimulates the center of the brain, which has a lot to do with something called supraventricular nucleus. Okay, and that is directly related to your pituitary and releases stress hormones. Okay, and this is again dependent upon, and the same way stress activates us, and the circadian cues, which is basically your light or the first entry of photons through the eye. Okay, and has a lot to do with it. These are the circadian rhythms, which gets you ready to face the stress of either due to the situation or just simply getting up to the body. So this is like a little clock that gets you ready to face the world. Okay, and it has a pattern to it, and this is totally independent that people who do animal research have been able to isolate this nucleus, and it's not exactly dependent upon light. It has its own internal body clock. The cells in this area of suprachiasmatic nucleus, they are like independent clock that Mother Nature has evolved, and they go on and off 12 hours, 24 hours. You can just see how that flashes in a petri dish, and the cells can be stained, and so it basically tells you when should you wake up and sleep. Again, it's triggered by light. The availability of sunlight, because we all required energy from sunlight. Okay, so this is this central mechanism, and it turns out not just the suprachiasmatic nucleus cells, but individual cells have responsible also. And this is a more dramatic representation of the hypothalamus pituitary axis. As the light comes out, hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary. Okay, and that releases something called the adrenal cortisol stimulating hormone, and that produces adrenaline from adrenal gland. Now, unlike other glands such as thyroid, okay, adrenal gland cannot store cortisol, so it has to manufacture, just like a short order cook, it has to manufacture. So it goes on and up, so, and that has been proven with varieties of research in the emotional centers called amygdala in your brain as to how, with the pulsatile flow of cortisone, the emotional response is better. Otherwise, yeah, you just kind of go blah to this to showing painful or depressing images. So this has been proven in in patients and and people who have had don't have adrenal gland and were given fixed doses versus pulsatile doses. Okay, so this so how physiology and it obviously it has a little delay that takes place. It's not an instant karma that takes place. So when you're under stress, when the levels drop, the pituitary gland, forms the hormone, and by the time it goes, so it's like the analogy can be given is the old-fashioned shower. It required the water to turn hot, and then when it gets too hot, you complain and you lower the volume, the sensor, and it cools down. So they are so-called feedback loops, which are intricate part of intracellular signaling, by the way. Okay, and this is pulsatility, so it is not just one steady state level that is there. And again, during the daytime also, it's not just a smooth curve rise, which one expected. Okay, you're up at 7 o'clock, let's raise and keep the level same. But it's a pulsatile thing, it goes on and up. Okay, so this is, and it has to do with swelling. So there is an oscillation pattern. So as I give you the analogy of, okay, and and this may have something to do with as you get older, your trouble is sleep because the cortisol levels drop, and so that your rhythmic feedback control is affected. That's why as we get older, we have hard time to fall asleep, and that so you can't just keep taking cortisol at that time because it's not the easiest hormone to handle. Your face gets puffy and varieties of side effects can take place, including diabetes, okay, and raising blood pressure, etc. So that is not a recommended treatment by any means. Okay, so oscillations are vital for health. The circadian, so stress hormone needs rhythm basically. So I already explained that high levels of cortisol. Okay, so when you're under stress, obviously, it's hard to sleep. Okay, whether you exam pressure or financial pressure or family situation, doesn't matter what type of stress, and it's related to aging and depression as well. We already talked about. Okay, and just basically just thinking about it does it, and not just cortisol that we talked about, which is the biggie, but there are other changes that takes place, in physiology, from daytime to nighttime. We'll talk about, we already mentioned body temperature, alertness is very obvious, concentration, okay, obviously you're able to concentrate a lot more during daytime than at nighttime, and then again, weight gain, if you're munching at nighttime, you're going to gain weight. In the same way, we'll talk more about melatonin, which was the fundamental to our vision and being able to sensitive form image in our eye. Okay, so that is the groundwork on which the rest of the vision and the difference between the image intensity evolved. So the proteins morphed further, and the varieties of proteins evolved in your eye called opsins, and that has a lot to do with your eyesight. Okay, so moving on. And so this again talks about the other hormones. We already had the body hormone, but your growth hormone has a lot to do with it also. That's why the children grow at nighttime, okay. And we talked about urine production, so that's why you don't have to get up too often at night, unless when you get older, it's a different story, by the way. Okay, and obviously the muscles become more flaccid, they don't. Okay, and the melatonin, which is the hormone related to your circadian or body 24-hour body cycles, is formed in the pineal gland. So Descartes was onto something, not necessarily his source, but this is the undersurface of the brain, And there is a structure called corpus callosum, which joins the two halves of the hemisphere. Okay, and these are something called medulla oblongata, and the various vital organs of the body are in this part, And okay, and the pineal gland is a little solitary structure, tiny little thing. It's that you can just see that, not much to look at. It's about the brains have empty spaces that are called ventricles, where the fluid circulates. So it's right on top of the so-called third ventricle. Okay, and one can clearly just say melatonin, melanos is the pigment that, has to do with your skin color. And the same way, the same hormone, we can put another name for it, we can call it darkness hormone, is related to your behavior. It hardwired to your biological clocks. Okay, it's a night hormone, so it peaks at nighttime in the early morning or 3 o'clock in the morning, and it drops during daytime. So it's exactly the opposite of what light does, Okay, and this is and it can be measured to see if you have sleep disorders, basically if you have, and similarly, this is called entrainment, and I'm sorry for the bad spelling, but the role of the eye, again, we can just see that the information comes from the eye and is transmitted by optic nerve, and this has nothing to do with image interpretation. This is a totally separate network, which is not related to your rods and cones. The cones are the ones that interpret your color vision, and the rods are differentiate between white and light. These are a separate type of cells which were later on discovered. It's called retinal ganglionic cells, which are part of the layer of the optic nerve of the retina. Relatively small numbers, but they have a very important role in controlling your circadian rhythm. And it's different that this was proven. This was initially questioned by various eye researchers and anatomists who have been studying eye for centuries, starting back to Henry Gray and even before him. And the retinal layers were proposed, but the discovery of the preganglionic cells of the retina had a huge role to play in the control of the circadian rhythm. And this can be proven in people who are blind in childhood versus those who are born blind. Okay, because they're obviously they have no response to light at all, so they get a lot of disorders of circadian rhythm. Okay, because it's harder for them to fall asleep. And this has a lot more bearing in doing surgery for cancer of the eye, especially a rare disease called retinoblastoma. As to when they operate, preserving these cells is a lot important. Otherwise, they would have, the blind people would have a lot more sleep disorders. So so different specialties need to overlap. And this is again another depiction of the cycle. From the retina, the impulse goes to suprachiasmatic nucleus, and there are various nucleus in the brain, and then the pineal pathway. And this, again, the impulse also comes in from your spinal cord and has something called a feedback loop on your pineal gland and secretion of melatonin. Okay, so so these are the varieties of information that is transmitted from the eye, as well as your muscles and other activities, that it's a full circuit is basically formed. Okay, and this is this independent organism. So, and the levels of melatonin that can be chemically measured by a blood test or even in a urine test, the metabolite can be measured. Okay, and that will be measured in dim light conditions. Okay, and this is a personalized, it's like a fingerprint, and it tells you whether you have a sleep disorder, either you have a delayed or advanced sleep phase disorder. Okay, so, and this is like a pacemaker built in by nature. Okay, so it's about 24 hours and a few more minutes in humans. Okay, and it's really directly related to daylight, and that's why people have difficulty that get messed up if you live in regions where there are very short daytime. Okay. And then again, a lot of the work that was done in the 20th century, mid-20th century, we already discovered in 1930, a German scientist named Hans Berger, discovered EEGs or brain waves. Okay, and then later on, various sleep apneas were classified, and a Kleitman network out of Chicago, they did a lot of research on determining circadian rhythms by sleeping in mammoth caves in middle USA and Kentucky. Okay, and so determine how the circadian rhythms are dependent upon light, and and this rapid eye movement is controlled in the brain region, okay, and this has a huge implication in sleep disorders such as sleepwalking, bedwetting, okay, and so this is directly related, and the treatment, that of some of these is done by light therapy, okay, and sometimes and as needed for melatonin does so. So this is just kind of a time frame of when all this science came into foray. Okay, and this is just shows you we already talked about the circadian rhythm as to how. So, but I think it's like probably I'm repeating myself, so I'm just going to skip over this. Okay, and so environmental life cycle. So it is synchronized between external and internal time. So if you manage to get good sleep, you can be alert during the day. And if it goes out of sync, especially with travel and night shift, it can have some disastrous sequences. Not just you're tired during the day, your performance of any activity that you do is affected. And primarily this has a huge role in jet lag when you travel across various time zones. And this again has the that is effect on shift work, because the shift work has been known to put stress on your life. And it's now, this may come as a surprise to some of you, that it has been classified as one of the risk factors for breast cancer, at least in the European medical system. And the US is another story, by the way. We don't go too much for preventive medicine, it's that to say. Okay, and this is again phase-dependent circadian rhythm. So again, light therapy and melatonin have been can advance or delay your the sleep cycle. Okay, and so this is dependent upon sunlight. So we are all creatures of the sun, and we are stardust, as one can say philosophically. And again, this is just to repeat, this is the classical Wikipedia slide, and there coordination better in the afternoon, reaction time, greatest cardiovascular fitness. Again, but there may be some other individuals who are totally differently. And by 9 p.m., just the melatonin secretion starts. Okay, and then as it peaks, your body temperature drops in the early morning hours. That's why you feel cold in the early morning hours, and your blood pressure starts rising up to face the activities of the day. Melatonin slows down, and then again you need to poop, and testosterone starts increasing. You become more alert gradually. Okay, so this is like we are creatures that depend upon light, unlike nocturnal animals. Okay, and this is again the slide of the famous flower, Mimosa pudica, which was known for 300 plus years. Okay, it clearly depends upon the light cycle. So even plants have a built-in cycle. Okay, And this is apparent even when it's in the closet, okay? And now the workhorse of genetics is the lowly fruit fly. And in 1970s, period gene were discovered, okay? And this was the start of the research on sleep medicine. And the word circadian is, it's classically, or it's a two-syllable word. Circa means about, and diem means day. So it goes along to how the word is coined. Okay, and then further research was carried out on the molecular biology by this scientist, Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbach, and Michael Young. Again, they were recognized for their, and they each had different things to contribute. Okay, and Hall and Young was what they call chronobiologists, meant they did research on the circadian rhythms in fruit flies. So they isolated genes, with the so-called period genes and fruitless gene. Okay, and so they were cloning this gene in the early days where it was not so easy to do. Okay, and then varieties of feedback loops were proposed for circadian clocks. And then later on, Dr. Ravache, who was in the middle, discovered something called the cycle gene. And so all these three people were recognized for their discovery, okay, by Nobel Prize in 2017. And we already talked about Seymour Benzer, who was one of the earlier pioneers, okay, whose lifestyle has been well summarized in a book by science writer Jonathan Weiner called Time, Love, and Memory, as to how meticulously he worked on the early phages and then varieties of mutants, because obviously in those days, it was not so easy to clone a gene, so they had to wait and meticulously look for mutants, under microscope to get to the idea. Okay.
Researchers at Howard Hughes Medical Institute are learning more about sleep using mice. 2 types of mouse sleep mutations were studied, sleepy and dreamless. The sleepy mice needed more sleep than normal mice, about 1/3 more. They carried a mutation in the SYK3 kinase gene. The dreamless mice did not show any rapid eye movement and carried a mutation in a sodium channel previously known to regulate neuronal excitability. Study author Masashi Yanagisawa said, "Sleep need still remains a mystery, but what we hope is that the kinase is maybe the key, the initial key to this big door."
Kinases are various workhorses for intracellular cell signaling mechanisms, and along with other chemical changes called phosphorylation, kinases, are ubiquitous in a cellular network or messaging. I think the music is more distracting than useful. Okay, so that's probably a more superficial slide about the genetic, about the Nobel laureates. Okay, and there are varieties of other chemicals that have been isolated and proposed. Okay, so this was some earlier work that was done. Okay, and finally it was rediscovered. About sleep arose from the the chemical changes that takes place and the toxins that build up. Okay, and such as lactic acid, carbon dioxide, and these need to be controlled. So an American scientist, Pappenheimer, repeated the classical works that was done by the French scientists Legendre and Piron. So they were able to isolate something called factor S, and there was labeled called hypnotoxin, molecule that is produced by the immune system. So that is, intricately connected with various other body's defense mechanism with sleep. Okay, so this was proposed, several, almost 100 years ago, and was rediscovered. Okay, and just so that we're not all exactly copybook, so the habits of difference, and I'm sure a lot of you can identify either with early morning creatures or night owl. Okay, and the patterns are totally different as to how lounging around versus dashing to work, and the night owls are better with jet lag, as is obvious. Okay, and so this is, and they can sleep soundly generally, while the night owls have difficulty because the whole society is geared towards the daytime creatures. Okay, because a lot of the things, such as museums would close, type of thing. So they're not going to be, when you really want to visit them, they're not going to be open. Okay, and this time, and if this is dramatically worse, then you have what we known as, advanced sleep phase disorder, either it's advanced or delayed, And so again, obviously, I mentioned earlier about the teenage years, which can be really of a challenge to a parent. Okay, and then there are some people who are less sleepy after 11 a.m. and they're more alert in the afternoon. So, and some people love to take naps. So it comes in all sorts of varieties of ways, have been identified. And different cultures have a different way of doing, because, especially in the tropical areas or even in the Spain, in other areas, the shops are shut in the afternoon. Okay, and night owls sometimes have a disadvantage, Okay, and we already talked about that, So, and how do you work around it? Because avoiding light exposure and late meals, So obviously, and you get this dramatic light exposure with electronic devices, that's going to play havoc on your sleep performance, and or even just going to your bathroom and with bright lights and brushing your teeth, has an effect. No wonder you have a hard time falling asleep. Okay, so and then again, even though the politically correct thing is that we're all same, male and females, but again, the response is slightly different in both age group, both sexes. Men are later chronotypes than women before 40, and the earlier types after 40. So lots of ladies who've been married for a long time, they know they can easily vouch that their husband, who used to be party, when they were in the 30s, tend to fall asleep in their 50s while reading the newspaper or watching TV. Okay, so this is observed, and the differences are in between young ages. So the guys are party goers type of thing, and then they dramatically change, as you can see from the graph, that the male pattern and female pattern kind of crosses over from each other. Okay, and so that's, the sexes do have some role in it, and again, the body clocks have a relationship with, and malaria parasite has learned to this, because when the human beings are more active, then the mosquitoes will bite you type of thing, and the malaria parasite has modified this life cycle based on. Okay, and similarly, varieties of viruses have a different behavior as well. Okay, and this probably gets a little too technical type thing. The varieties of proteins are inside, as we talked about earlier, they're in each and every cell. So they again have their own mini response to circadian rhythms. So this is related to virus spike, because the virus load is related to days after infection, how it infected during daytime, and so you can see how the response is different after infection. So how you respond to viruses have a lot to do with it based on your immunity. Okay, and malaria parasite matures inside the red blood cells and needs glucose. So it has to do with your body's circadian rhythm and your body's blood levels of availability of food in your food. Okay, so the parasite has really kind of hijack the body's mechanism in that way. So these are in the varieties of form. The ring cells is immature, the trophocyte that feeds on glucose, okay, and then the mature stage. So when there is more likelihood, when your sugars are up, that's when the parasite is more active and tries to morph, okay, and it tries to divide further, okay. So it's a real marvel of evolutionary parasitism, okay. And again, I think I'm not going to delve too much into it, so, but this is just the same thing, glucose in blood as to how, the parasite changes, its behavior based on when to attack you the most and when to take advantage of it. Similarly, circadian clocks have risen on human behavior, even in advanced civilizations. Okay, the West Coast teams, they do better during late games. Okay, the swimmers have a better advantage, in early morning hours. So if the meet is held in the afternoon, obviously their performances will be compromised. Okay, and again, and jet lag when you're traveling across the East Coast teams, do bad on Monday Night Football because they're traveling against their body clock. Okay, and so this has been proven with varieties of observations and clinical data. Okay, and then again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're living in northern climates, especially near the poles in winter times, this can affect a huge number of people with something called seasonal affective disorder. Okay, and and there are varieties of light therapies that have been tried and is related to depression more in women, unfortunately, than in men. And artificial light again has a huge effect on it. Okay, and so this is, and this has been well known, and from the classics era, and has been aggravated with our constant 24-hour societies. And again, the joys of parenting, and okay, because obviously the child's behavior, okay, bringing up parents has a huge effect, and exactly, and the circadian rhythm slowly changes, okay, between school and non-school days. That can be very problematic because obviously during weekend the kids want to catch up on their sleep while the parents want them to go to church or activities at that time. So this is, the sleep-wake cycles, so that has a huge effect on their performance, both academically, sports-wise. And, as you can see, we spend most of 1/3 of our life sleeping. And the sleep has a huge effect on not just your energy and metabolic needs, but information processing, memory consolidation, and toxin clearance, and healing of the body. So it's absolutely critical for survival. And without sleep, obviously you'll be dead in a few days. Okay, and then again, we've already shown about the various hormones that are intricately related. Not only that, varieties of neurotransmitters are closely related to as well. Acetylcholine, which is the workhorse of neurotransmission, adrenaline, histamine, and the allergic response, dopamine, the so-called feel-good hormone, serotonin, which has a huge relation to depression, and varieties of the lesser known hormones, which again related to inhibitory response on neuronal structures, are intricately related. They are drivers and modulators of physiological activity. Okay, and and again, these are the various biological clocks we talked about from the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that's the sleep pressure builds up, and the societal pressure that keeps you awake. And this is like a brain network that needs to be, which is intricately connected to each other. And the moment you wake up, the sleep pressure gradually starts building up. Slight dip in the mid-afternoon, so this is properties inside each and every cells, which is a fine intricate dance of genes, proteins, and your behavior. Okay, and then if it gets out of sync, then you're in trouble basically. Okay, and again, and it changes with age that we already talked about, in the male and female. So this is just a more graphic depiction of the same. Okay, and again, so I'm sorry, this is a repeat of the slide. Sorry, my bad. Okay, and eye is equally important. So we talked about the brushing of teeth and the melatonin feedback, and these are the varieties of regions of the brain which are responsible. Okay, prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for hormone called chemical called glutamine, and this is it's acetylcholine. Okay, ventrolateral centers, the thalamus, which is the relay center. Okay, and these are the varieties of nuclei in the brain, which are respond to the various chemicals. Okay, and we already talked about the retinal ganglionic cells, which are responsible, and so this gets into a lot more neuroanatomy than you would care to know for. Okay, I think we have covered enough, about half of the material that I had discussed earlier, and I think we'll stop at this level, and we'll do sleep part 2 as the time permits. Okay, thank you folks for watching. Okay, bye-bye.